Thank you all so much for coming today. We're excited to have you. My name is Peggy, and I'm the digital content librarian for Snow Isle Libraries, and I'm excited to have you all here for our presentation on fashion and style in the Pacific Northwest. I have a couple of housekeeping notes for you all. Your mics are muted and your cameras are off. If you have any questions, please put them in our chat, and staff will gather them up so we can share them with Clara, our presenter, during the Q&A portion at the end of this presentation. We'll get to as many questions as possible, and we will also be using chat to share links and other information with you. We're recording this event and it will be available on the Snow Isle Libraries YouTube channel in a couple of weeks. And we have closed captioning available. You just need to click the CC at the bottom of your Zoom window to enable that. Now I'm excited to introduce our presenter for today, Clara Berg. Clara is the Curator of Collections at the Museum of History and Industry. She oversees the care of the museum's extensive collection of 3D artifacts and does research and presentations about its contents. She grew up in Seattle, but received her master's degree in fashion and textile studies at the Fashion Institute of Technology in New York City. And in 2019, she curated MoHi's exhibit, Seattle Style Fashion Function. Clara, I'm so excited to have you here. Thank you for being with us today for this presentation.
Hi, well, thank you so much for having me today. I'm gonna share my screen. Thank you, Peggy, and thank you for the invitation to speak today. So as she mentioned, that I am the Curator of Collections at MoHi. That doesn't mean that I'm in charge of the whole museum or the whole collection. I specifically work with the 3D collection. So as opposed to the library, which is at MoHi is the 2D, the photos, the documents, the archives. I work with everything that is an object. But my specialty is in clothing and fashion. So a little bit about the MoHi collection. So the whole 3D collection at MoHi is about 100,000 items. And of that, the clothing and textile collection is about a third. So that's about 30,000 items. So that's clothing, that's accessories, that's also flat textiles like quilts and little pieces of lace and flags. And our collecting focus is things that were made or worn or used or sold in the Puget Sound region. So it has to be one of those to fit our mission. So I've been giving presentations about fashion and style in Seattle and sort of the region for a while. And it was an interest of mine for a long time. But I get a lot of snarky responses about that when I tell people that that's an interest of mine, particularly started when I was in New York and studying at FIT. And the idea that I wanted to go back to Seattle and learn about fashion and style in this area was very puzzling to people. A lot of New Yorkers kind of feel that their city is the best city on earth, and it's really baffling that you want to go somewhere else, or you want to tell other stories. And that I think there's a lot of stereotypes about Seattle and the Pacific Northwest, and I get kind of snarky comments. And then I found that when I came back to Seattle, people are pretty self-deprecating in this area about our clothing and our style. And I get a lot of, when I say what I do, they're like, ugh, is there any fashion in Seattle, or what are you studying? So I thought it'd be fun today to frame the presentation around the 4 most common snarky comments that I get. Or sort of misconceptions about style in this region. One of them is just flat out wrong. And then the other ones are not necessarily wrong, but I think they're wrong in their snarkiness, because there's some really interesting, rich history there with that stereotype. So the first one is people say, ugh, Seattle fashion is just outdoor gear. So the implication that, oh yeah, we don't have any dressy clothes. Everyone's just ready to go on a hike. And of course, there is an element to truth to that, which is that we love the outdoors here, that we have this beautiful setting, we have trees, we have mountains, we have water, and a lot of people want to be out in nature, and you need appropriate clothing to do so. So I love this photo of a bunch of skiers at Snoqualmie Pass in the 30s. But that outdoor gear story is also part of our regional clothing, or a regional industry, that we have a very strong outdoor gear clothing industry because of the interest that we have here in Seattle. And that history really started in 1897 with the Alaska Gold Rush. So gold was discovered in the Klondike region of Alaska, also kind of part of Canada and the Yukon. And everyone wanted to go up and get that gold. And Seattle was one of the main places that people had to leave from, the embarkation point. And you couldn't go unless you had proper gear, unless you're ready to face the cold of Alaska. So Seattle, all of these stores sprung up to sell gear to go up to Alaska, and kicked off this industry of Alaska outfitters in Seattle. One of the most famous, which is still here in Seattle, is Filson. C.C. Filson started an Alaska outfitter company in 1897 during the gold rush, and then it became this company that made clothes for recreational outdoor gear like hunting and fishing, and then also for particular jobs in Seattle. So here we have a hunting jacket and breeches in the Mohi collection from 1922. And on the right is a contemporary version of their famous Mackinac cruiser jacket, but it was first patented in 1914 and was built for timber cruisers, which are the guys who survey areas of timber before, to sort of what kind of trees we have, what level, how are we cutting this area, which trees are we cutting? But it's become a kind of staple of their company. They still make it today. It's beloved by it looks cool. So it's not just function that people wear it because they love these heavy wool jackets. Of course, REI was also founded here. It was started by Mary and Lloyd Anderson in the 1930s. And they, at the time, some of the best outdoor gear, especially for climbing and mountaineering, that they wanted to do was being made in Europe. And so the co-op element was that they were kind of creating a group of people that wanted to buy some of this material in bulk, and it being cheaper to import it in bulk. And that's how REI started. And these shoes we have in the Mohi collection were imported from Sweden, a good pair of hiking boots. Of course, then, as much like with Filson, there were many companies that were springing up in Seattle so that some of the best gear in the world was starting to be made in Seattle. Eddie Bauer was a real person. Sometimes people think that might just be a brand name, but he had a store in Seattle and was an avid outdoorsman, as you can see draped in fish here. But he had a near-death experience where he almost died there was ice rain and he was getting hypothermia. And when he survived, he said, I want to build a better outdoor coat. And his goose down insulated jacket that he made in 1936, it's always hard to say that someone invented something in fashion because there's always precedents. There was he had an uncle who had fought in the Russo-Japanese War, that there was insulated down jackets that were being used by the Russian army. So there was precedences, but I think I said that word wrong, but that he was the one to take down and use to quilt it to try to keep everything in place and market it to the outdoor industry. And so that's, even though you can find these kind of one-off examples, the version that he made is really the one that spawned kind of all the puffy down jackets that we know today and revolutionized a way to sort of dress warmly and lightly. There's so many other companies that some short-lived, some longer-lived, that were here in Seattle outfitting people. We have this great wool ski suit from the Seattle Woolen Company. I love this photo of this model wearing a bathing suit from the Saxony Knitting Company. There was a pretty substantial knitwear industry in Seattle. And knitwear is very associated with sports clothing. It moves with you, it's comfortable. So making tennis sweaters, making bathing suits, and then this hiking outfit from a small company called Queen City. This is from the 1920s when previously women were hiking mostly in skirts or split skirts. And in the 20s, it was getting more common for women, first of all, to be hiking at all. And then also that it was a little more acceptable to wear pants for hiking, not pants for evening wear yet, there's still a lot of rules about wearing pants, but for hiking, it got a little more normalized. A few other Seattle companies, Mountain Safety Research was one of the first to put Gore-Tex in there, to use Gore-Tex as for commercial garments. Of course, a staple now for Seattle rain gear. And I love the way that we posed this mannequin, pit zips. So ventilations at the armpits or on the sides of a rain jacket, because you want to keep the rain out, but also you get sweaty. Roffey was a ski wear company in Seattle that in the 1980s was the largest ski manufacturer in the US, very influential. And then Outdoor Research is still in business and known for really high quality outdoor gear, similar to sort of the legacy of Eddie Bauer and others of trying to make problem solving, trying to make the best gear for really hardy situations. And these gaiters are some of the first things that company made, also based on a near-death experience of gaiters that failed and frostbite was had. And so how do I fix this problem so that people can keep adventuring? But I think I'm ready for my next topic, which is Seattle is too casual. So this is kind of similar to the outdoor gear one, but slightly different of that. Again, oh, there's not fashion in Seattle, or we all just love our casual dressing. And so we're not interested in fashion. But casual clothing has a really interesting history and is fashion. This is a quote that I love from Catherine Blaine, who came to Seattle in 1854 with her husband, who was a preacher, and she has this quote about the governor. The governor is as rough in his appearance as any of our backwoodsmen. They say he wears his red flannel shirt, no white one, coarse clothes, and an unshaven beard. This is from about 100 years later, this painting by Kenneth Callahan of these two loggers, one of which is wearing a red shirt. And the red flannel shirt was kind of a workwear staple for loggers, for miners, for all kinds of kind of hardy jobs, in contrast to the starched white shirt that you would wear if you were governor, usually in most places. And so the idea that even in early Seattle, the governor was like, I'm more comfortable. I know I'm supposed to be dressed up. I know I'm the governor, but we're out here on the frontier and this flannel shirt is warm. It's comfortable. I feel better in it. And this is what I'm going to wear. And thinking about early in Seattle, that's sort of being the attitude of, you know, it didn't come out here to be dressed up. It came out here to sort of do work and do what works for me. Much like the outdoor gear industry that sprung up in Seattle, other parts of Seattle's clothing industry were, if it was not outdoor gear or workwear, it was often casual wear, or sort of things that blended a little bit of those categories. So on the left, this is a sweater from the 1970s, but Lasley Knitting was a company that started in the 40s. And as I mentioned, there was several knitwear companies in Seattle, this one focusing on Letterman sweaters and kind of school sweaters. And this one has a particularly fun history from the 70s, is that the woman who owned this, or she was a teenager, she was in high school, that she wanted to be on the tennis team, but there was no girls tennis team when she applied, or that she was on the boys team, but then the principal said, we can't have girls on the boys team, sorry. And while she was in high school, Title IX was passed, which is the law that required that you have an equal opportunities in sports, that if you have a boys tennis team, you have to have a girls tennis team. And so as a senior in high school, she then was on the varsity tennis team. She was the captain of that team. She also was on the swimming team. And this sweater that, you know, is probably similar to sweaters that the company's made for the last 30 years. It looks like it could be from the 50s, but from this very important moment in history where women were now competing in sports that they hadn't been allowed to in some schools. And then this is an ad from a company I've been learning about recently, Betty Baxley, which sold what they called tub frocks, which at first it's like, okay, are you wearing this in the bath or what is this? That a tub frock is a dress that you could wash yourself in a tub. So opposed to something that needs to be dry cleaned or needs sort of a specialty cleaning, or you need to remove the buttons before you wash it, or all of that. This is what a lot of us wear today, which is something that you can put in soap and water and rinse out and hang to dry. Probably you would still iron it or steam it, but and I love they have this idea that you can wear these all day long, although it's sort of a casual vision for the day. So clothing in the morning, for sports, for afternoon wear, and then their evening wear is evening pajamas. So, but in the 30s, that wasn't necessarily bedtime pajamas but it was sort of casual evening wear with these long pants. One of my favorite things in the Mohai collection and sort of this casual wear industry is that there was this company called Foster Hochberg, and during the World's Fair, which is celebrating its 60th anniversary this year, they commissioned this, they had a illustrator from the Seattle Times named Jerry Abbott, who they asked to make this illustration of the fairgrounds. And so she put the Space Needle, you can see the fountain, the monorail, the arches of the Science Pavilion into this great print that then they had 3 different colorways. So the blue and green one was what we had on display in the Seattle Style exhibit. And then this is a close-up, but this sort of pink and red and blue one is currently on display at MoHI. We have a little display about the 1962 World's Fair. And the third colorway is brown and yellow and orange, but we only have a small swatch of it in the collection. I think it's a lot less popular, but I just love this print. And so they put it on shirts and skirts and dresses, and it was all sort of casual clothing for women and for teen girls, but just these fun cotton prints. Later in the 20th century, Seattle really, our casual wear industry got spotlighted because it was this, there was kind of a boom in the industry that starting in the 1970s with a company called Britannia and then also one called Shaw Safari, Seattle was sort of this hub for casual clothing and for manufacturing or designing the clothing stateside and manufacturing overseas, which as we know now, that's mostly how the industry works. And there's a lot of labor concerns about where stuff is being made and who's making it. But this was also an innovation that made things very affordable and made things very quick to design and to sell. So Seattle was kind of on the cutting edge of that. Britannia sort of went into decline at the end of the 70s and the early 80s. And then all these executives from and designers from that company spawned all these other companies. So Union Bay is one that's actually still in business that was founded by former Britannia execs. International News is actually a collaboration between the Shaw Safari founders, which is Raj and Ankhil Shah, who are immigrants from India, partnering with some other people formerly from Britannia to make International News. So it's another, Shaw Safari was still going on. It was another brand that they were selling a lot of prints and really interesting graphic designs. And then Genera was another big one in the 1980s, which had its biggest hit and its simultaneous failure with their hypercolor. If anyone remembers this, it was a huge fad that these fabrics that you would touch and the heat would change the color of the fabric. But it is a huge success for them. But then, like a lot of fads, it crashed really quickly and the business went belly up. A lot of people don't know that Tommy Bahama is actually a local company because it doesn't have a local aesthetic at all. It's tropical, it's Florida, it's Hawaii, but it was founded by people who had come from Genera, who had come from Britannia, who'd come from Union Bay. And when they wanted to found this casual clothing company, the infrastructure was here in Seattle to do it. So even though the aesthetic, they didn't open Tommy Bahama stores until this business was much bigger, but the infrastructure for this kind of casual wear company was here in Seattle. So that's where they founded it. And so we can't talk about this area without talking about grunge. So a lot of people want to talk about grunge, like, the only time Seattle was relevant was during the grunge movement. And it is true that the grunge movement was a pretty big deal. And I was trying to figure what picture am I going to use for this? And I had a lot of fun recently during the pandemic, stuck at home, watching old episodes of the Seattle show Almost Live, which was a comedy show that aired on King 5. And they had a lot of funny stuff in the 90s about grunge. And this was, they had a skit called How the Grunge Stole Christmas. And you can see it on YouTube. And this is the host, John Keister, dressed as the grunge. And if you know what John Keister looks like, you know this is a wig on him. With his backwards baseball cap, his plaid flannel, and there's also jokes about his Doc Martens. And then he goes and tries to ruin Christmas for all of these guys in these grunge bands. Kim Thile from Soundgarden is in that picture on the right. But he doesn't do it you have to watch it. It's a lot of fun. And so, people make a lot of jokes about grunge and but what is grunge? So for fashion historians, it's a movement that we refer to as anti-fashion or sort of unfashion, that it was intended to rebel against what was going on that it was intended to be actively rejecting the fashion world. So it kind of came up in the late 1980s, and the 80s were thinking of like Reaganism and sort of more is more. And also that music at the time, you have a lot of what we called hair bands, you know, complex costumes and big hair and like being made up. And that grunge was kind of more connected to the punk movement and rejecting that. And it was sort of a thrift store look. It was intended to be cheap, and it was intended to be, you know, your jeans are falling apart, but you just wear leggings underneath and let them be ripped. The guy on the left is this is a photo in the Mohai PI collection. And it describes to the reporter that everything he's wearing either came from the thrift store or was free, because it was like on his friend's floor, or he found it at this venue after the show was over. It's hard to collect grunge for the museum collection because it's almost by definition these discardable clothing. So this is one thing that we have. We have this quilted flannel shirt that someone wore to a bunch of shows in Seattle and Olympia. But you know, a lot of people, they threw it away. It wasn't considered valuable. And that we had on loan from Mopop, we had a sweater that belonged to Kurt Cobain in the Seattle Style exhibit. And unless you know it belonged to Kurt Cobain, it's a really boring looking sweater. So a lot of what makes grunge is sort of the whole attitude, the whole look that a person puts together, but the individual garments don't really look like much on their own. I think it's worth remembering, though, that grunge was a huge movement, and it was a movement that was picked up on by the sort of higher ups in the fashion community, with the two kind of most famous examples being this editorial that appeared in Vogue called Grunge and Glory that was photographed by Stephen Meisel and Grace Coddington. Those are both names that are familiar to a lot of people, of using some pretty familiar models from the 90s and creating these sort of grunge looks with stuff that was in at the time of floral dresses, but paired with heavy boots and sweaters with holes in them and plaids. And then the other quite well-known example is that the designer Marc Jacobs, who at the time was working for Perry Ellis, did a grunge collection in 1992. And it was pretty widely reviled at the time, as you can imagine. The actual grunge people in Seattle were just sort of appalled that this movement was being co-opted. You know, once it's on the runways of New York, then it's fully dead, right? It's trying to be an anti-fashion movement, and fashion's trying to steal it. And then the fashion people were sort of disgusted that this junk, this thrift store junk, was being shown on the runway. And it was not a successful collection, as you can imagine, because why would you buy an $800 plaid shirt when you can buy a $5 plaid shirt at the thrift store? But in the last few years, people have really been revisiting that moment. And of course, Marc Jacobs, he lost his job at Perry Ellis because of that. But he's continued to be a very successful designer, one who's known as sort of being on the pulse and being really in touch with youth movements, and realizing that he was onto something. You know, maybe it didn't really work to sell it at the high level, but that he knew that this was an important movement. He could sense that this was kind of a change in fashion, and it was important to acknowledge it. And there's fashion writers who wrote vicious reviews of that show that have been kind of revisiting that in the last couple of years and wondering if they were wrong. And this is just the result of like a 5-minute Google search. Grunge is really in now. Gen Z kids love grunge. And the New York Fashion Week had lots of grunge references. Just this one in February. I found this on Pinterest, 25 cool grunge aesthetic ideas to copy in 2022. So when people say, oh, you know, all Seattle has is grunge. Well, other than New York and London, I mean, how many other cities have a movement that has been this influential that is really associated with the city? I mean, grunge is now kind of up there with punk as important countercultural anti-fashion movements that have been continuing to resonate with people. So I feel like we could do a lot worse than having grunge associated with Seattle. And then the last one, that is the one that is just incorrect, is people say there's no high fashion in Seattle, or there's never been any high fashion in Seattle. Or the worst version of this is, you know, a new store opens in Seattle and someone says, oh, finally fashion is coming to Seattle. And this is something that, being in the Mohai collection, it just is disproven every day. So here are some examples of some of the stars, the high fashion stars we have in the collection, things that are the types of items that you would see in a collection like the Met or FIT. We have this gorgeous couture butterfly dress from Elsa Schiaparelli that was worn by a woman named Vivian, or her brother was named Vivian Karkik. She was Gwendolyn Karkik Pletchev. That is just from a famous collection that Schiaparelli did. We have more than just Schiaparelli, but we happen to have such beautiful photos of these two, so I included them. So this middle dress is a gown from the house of Schiaparelli, but during the time that Givenchy was designing for the house. And that was worn by a woman named Ruth Blethen Clayburn. She was married a couple times. She had a few different last names. Ruth Schoenfeld Blethen Clayburn. And then on the right, Mariano Fortuny is a very well-known designer that made these pleated gowns that were sort of timeless. He made from the 19-teens through the 1940s. And this one we have belonged to a woman named Zoe Dusan, who was known as Seattle's first modern art dealer, that she had this gallery in Seattle to really promote art, both making Seattle interested in national art and then also promoting local artists as sort of giving them recognition and fame. So that's women who were traveling the world and bringing kind of the best of fashion back to Seattle, but we also had stores and connections that were doing that. So in the 19th century, these are some examples. This hat that we have on the right, we know that the donor has this story about how she had an evening event to go to. I think it was an opera performance in Seattle, and ordered this from New York. And so this hat, that there was some store that she could order it from, and that they had it come by train from New York in time for the performance. On the left is an illustration of Seattle's first department store that changed names a couple times. In the late 1880s, it was known as Toklas and Singerman. Before that, it was called the San Francisco store. Later, it became known as McDougal Southwick. But when it was Toklas and Singerman, they built this grand multi-story building in 1888, these big windows. They had an elevator, I think the first elevator in Seattle. It burned down in the Great Seattle Fire. So that's why this is just an illustration. But they did rebuild and continued into the 20th century as McDougal Southwick. And in the center, this evening coat that was sold by a company that started, a store that started after the Great Seattle Fire, J.S. Graham, John S. Graham was the owner of it. And he was importing garments from Europe and bringing them to, and this is just a beautiful, exquisitely made coat with this pleating in the back that probably was one of these imports. In the early 20th century, we start having stores that are making more direct buying in Europe. So in the 19th century, it was probably a connection that they had a liaison that they would work with to order stuff. But Frederick and Nelson that's a department store in Seattle. They had the French gown shop where they were selling Paris originals. And then one of my favorite Seattle personalities, Helen Igo, this is a dress and bolero that belonged to her and was from Paris. So she was a store owner that opened a store in 1910 and ran it through 1950. And she was making annual, sometimes more than once a year, trips to Europe, which in the 19-teens and 20s was, I mean, that's a train trip across the country. That's a steamship trip across an ocean, an incredible amount of time, an incredible amount of money. And the fact that she was successful, that she was doing well at her store, that means that there were clients who were willing to pay for that work to be put in, to go in person, to see the fashion shows, to see the fashion, to make buying decisions, to come back to Seattle with garments and have that kind of clout in the city. That wouldn't have existed if nobody cared about fashion in Seattle. A little later in the 20th century, I just hopefully will be up within the next month. I just finished an article for History Link about Best Apparel, which was founded by Dorothy Cabot Best and her husband Ivan. And it was a specialty women's store. They had a real range of, having a range of price points was one of their selling points. They had some pretty high-end things, but also they tried to have affordable things at all kind of price levels. And this is another piece that's on display right now at the museum. This skirt suit from 1961 belonged to Louise McKinney, who was the wife of Reverend Samuel McKinney of Mount Zion Baptist Church. And Reverend McKinney was a college pal of Martin Luther King. And he was the one, McKinney was the one who invited Martin Luther King to come to Seattle in 1961 to speak and do a few events here. And so Louise McKinney bought this suit at Best Apparel. It was it was pretty pricey for the time. Wore it for one of those events with Dr. King, and then continued to wear it for a lot of events in Seattle afterwards. It's really a fun piece from Beth's Apparel. And then John Doyle Bishop, one of my favorite Seattle stories. He actually bought the store from Helen Igo, that woman who was making those long trips to Europe, and sort of took over that type of business for the 50s through the 1980s, or he died in 1980, so through the 70s. He did sell some things from Europe, but also mostly really high-end stuff from New York, top designer names, bringing them to Seattle, and he was beloved, hugely successful, had this really amazing, robust business. Again, couldn't have existed if there wasn't anyone here interested in fashion. And we do have local designers. These are both examples from around the 50s. So range people who had stores, people who worked out of their homes. The one on the left is a woman who had a business out of her house, Clara B. White. And this is a dress or sort of a coat dress that she made for herself. Howard Blair was a designer who also worked out of his home, was known for his very lavish, as you can see, evening gowns, and wedding dresses were his specialty. Again, if you say there's no fashion in Seattle, who's making this? This is not a hiking outfit. Each of these slides could be like a whole presentation. We have accessory designers in Seattle. John Eaton, probably one of the better known hat designers. He had a shop in Seattle and then also taught at Seattle Central. And so a lot of the hat makers that are still in Seattle, and we do have a pretty substantial community of hat makers in this region. A lot of them learned from him or learned from someone who learned directly from him. So he's kind of like the grandfather of millinery in Seattle. And then on the right, this is a newer acquisition, but this is from a company, sort of high-end luxury handbag company called Nuciano. And the founder is Joy Ebejimba, who's originally from Nigeria and infuses some of that inspiration into these handbags and the cowrie shell decoration on here, which is a West African sign of wealth and a historic symbol that she incorporates into these bags. But she's here in Seattle, she designs in Seattle. So it's a really cool company. And then of course, if you know Luli Young, who is a couture designer, has these fabulous store windows on Fifth Avenue in downtown Seattle, but she also designed the Alaska Airlines uniforms. If you've been flying lately, which many of us have not been, maybe we're back to flying. This incredible gown that she lent to us for the Seattle Style exhibit. And of course, Nordstrom. We haven't even talked about Nordstrom yet, which actually connects to one of the first stories that I told of the gold rush, that John Nordstrom tried to make his fortune in Alaska and actually did come back with some money and started this shoe store. Then they purchased Beth's Apparel in the 60s and is, of course, this very large fashion company that we know now. Again, it's like, if there's no fashion here, like what is Nordstrom doing? So I thought that I would close with what stereotype would I like to promote, or what one am I okay repeating? And I think the one that I like is that people in the Pacific Northwest like to do their own thing, because and I realized I didn't include the caption for this. This item is a new acquisition from an artist named Malcolm Proctor, and his artist, he goes by sort of the artist title Wolf Deluxe, and he does these wearable art pieces where he gets garments from the thrift store or from friends and paints them with these beautiful kind of pop art inspired, but there's also some African art inspiration of these line illustrations that are just so graphic and so compelling. And this one is like a really heavy parka, so you could take this skiing if you wanted. And so I think that is the stereotype that I'm okay with in Seattle, is that Seattleites sort of don't like being pigeonholed into one thing. Some people do love dressing up, but we also like the ability to be casual. Some people hate dressing up and they like their outdoor gear clothes. They want to be able to wear their Gore-Tex to the opera. A couple other companies that I like talking about we have Utilikilt here, which is the company that makes sort of targeted towards men, unbifurcated garments. So kilts that have no separation between the legs. That's what unbifurcated means. And I was just at a fundraiser in Seattle and someone was wearing Utilikilt. And it's like, it's just not a formal event in Seattle until somebody shows up in a Utilikilt. But again, it's that idea of, I don't want to play by your rules. I want to wear something fun. I want to wear something that is comfortable and something that I like. Another really successful Seattle company is Tomboy X, which sells underwear that is targeted for a range of gender identities. So anyone can wear it. So including trans people, including non-binary people, and that also being really important of underwear being kind of that first layer to create your identity and what you feel comfortable in. And I think that comfort element, that it can be physical comfort, it can be sort of emotional comfort, it can just be, and people can feel comfortable in really fancy things. They feel like themselves, it empowers them. So I love the idea of that all of these things are part of Seattle's story. And it's okay that any of them that you resonate with, that's all part of it. It doesn't have to be one thing, and we don't have to poo-poo the outdoor gear, the casual wear, that those are all really vital pieces of our fashion story. So these are just a range of some photos that I pulled from Mohai's collection of dressy clothing, casual clothing, this sort of hippie on the end, that we like to do our own thing. We like to be ourselves. So that is the end of my main talk, and which I realize I went through it a little quicker, so I'm happy to go back and answer questions and say more about any of those.
Claire, thank you so much for that presentation. It's been delightful. For anyone in the audience, please drop your questions into chat and then we will get to as many as we can. We've already got a few questions waiting, so why don't we dive in? One question is, what fabric were the Betty Baxter dresses made of?
Yes, so Betty Baxley, I actually have I have this bad habit of buying things off eBay and then donating them to the Mohai collection. We don't have a big acquisitions fund. So I actually have two Betty Baxley dresses that I have purchased. One of them from the 50s is more of like a sort of synthetic kind of rayon type. It feels very easy to wash, but I did just get one from the 20s, which is definitely cotton. And I'm guessing those 20s dresses, it's kind of on the cutting edge of when they're doing rayon. So maybe there's a little rayon there, but I would guess that they're mostly going to be cotton, because that's going to really be the easiest thing to do a print that's the color's not going to bleed out. And you can just wash it with soap and it'll hang to dry really easily. So that's, again, I can't speak for every Betty Baxley dress, but if I was to guess, I'm guessing we're talking about cotton.
Nice, thank you. Someone else brought up the Singerman store. It sounds like it might be called
Toklas and
Holding.
Singerman.
Is that still in Seattle?
So I like showing these pictures. So I'm going to go back to that.
Yeah,
I love that the picture of the building. I thought I could be slicker than this, but so that started as a store called the San Francisco store, and it was opened in, I think, 1876 or 75. I forget exactly all the years where they changed the name. And so one fun fact is, if you know who Alice V. Toklas is, who was like the longtime partner of Gertrude Stein, that's the same Toklas. Like, that's her dad.
wow.
In Seattle for a few years when she was a teenager. So she hasn't said much about it, but so it was called Toklas and Singerman. It changed hands to be McDougall Southwick sometime in the late 19th century, and then McDougall Southwick lasted into the 1960s. So it is not still in business, but it's crazy that in the 1960s, there was a store that was celebrating a 90th anniversary in Seattle.
Yeah.
One reason I think it went out of business is there was this, it used to be that all of the main stores were along 2nd Avenue, and Frederick and Nelson was the first store to move what was uptown to sort of the like 5th and Pine, 5th and Pike area. So the Frederick and Nelson store is where Nordstrom is now. And it was weird. It was like so far uptown, but all of the stores kind of followed. except for McDougall Southwick. They stuck with Second Avenue. They renovated at Second Avenue. And I think that was the wrong choice. That was just sort of not where the retail core moved. So that was, I think, one of the factors in their demise.
Yeah, thank you. Our next question is from someone who's interested in knowing more about the hat making and millinery aspect. They'd like to know who's kind of the customer base for modern millinery in Seattle, besides things like baseball caps or knit caps that are more, I think, functional, as it were, and what do these kinds of new hat styles look like?
Yeah, that's a great question. I wish I had more, wish I could suddenly put a bunch of images onto the PowerPoint, but some names to Google if you want. Wayne Wickern is one of the major milliners in Seattle. We also have pieces from a woman named Sonia Witten-Gill, and her collection is called Fei Wu's Signature Collection. So you can kind of Google either of those. We also have some on the website. There's like, so, I mean, I feel like there are people in chat that are like, oh, this person. So a lot of them, they're working mostly in felt and straw, which are kind of moldable and kind of classic fabrics to use for hat making. So Sonia Witten-Gill, if I mentioned, is Black, and there is like a whole kind of Black women church hat tradition. There's also a woman named Henrietta Price, was sort of had a shop on Madison Avenue and was really making incredible hats, often for sort of the Black church community. So that's a piece of it. I think it's what's great about the millinery community in Seattle is that, yes, it is kind of a smaller market. There's not as many people that wear, big straw hats and decorative things, but they are really collaborative, and they work together and they support each other. And they, instead of trying to compete for this small amount, they, share studio space, they encourage each other and try to build the market, and have, as far as I can tell, have some really devoted clients. And I mean, there's like weddings of, kind of fascinators. There's of course sort of events like, Kentucky Derby parties. But they make kind of a range of things that are fancier and things that can be everyday. And we had an event at MoHi with Sonia Witten-Gill and Henrietta Price talking about their millinery work. And Henrietta Price, her whole presentation was that she had someone come up and put a hat on, and then she would adjust it to make it look perfect. And it just changed, like amazing. It was just like, oh yeah, that person looks amazing in this hat. So I think that it's less common, but if you try some of these hats on, you're like, oh wow, maybe I'm a hat person. I didn't know.
The presentation with the hat adjustment sounds
fantastic. It was fantastic.
Someone in the audience asked if you have any information on iMagnon.
Sure. Yeah, iMagnon, that was actually primarily a California. It was started in California, and but Seattle was, I think, for a while, its only branch outside of California. So we did have an iMagnon store, and so this is like 1920s, and I think that they maybe lasted into the 90s, but they were kind of a high-end specialty store that was, so it would have been like high-end ready to wear, and probably some imports from Europe. We have a photo in the MoHi collection of a model in a very famous Dior dress at iMagnon. So that probably was a fashion show that they had coming through. So we have a fair number of iMagnon things in the collection. It's kind of that's like a weird borderline thing where it's not a Seattle founded company. It's not based in Seattle, but I mean, the iMagnon store was a big deal in Seattle. And there was a lot of Seattle women that were really devoted to that place being where they were getting their high-end fashion. So it is a Seattle story in that sense too.
Awesome, thank you. We've got a couple questions about MoHi and its connection to fashion. Will there be any other style exhibits available at MoHi? And are there any more pictures available on the website to enjoy?
Yeah. So for the pictures, so a lot of the reasons in the, I was going to promote the Seattle Style Book. I had a slide, but also, so if you love this content, have a copy of this is a library presentation. We love books. So we did have a publication from the Seattle Style exhibit, and a lot of the photos included in this presentation were from photographing for that catalog. we are trying to get more and more stuff online as much as possible. If you go to the MOHI website, there's links to looking at photos. And so initially our online database was all sort of a photo database, but we're now including artifacts on there. So everything that was included in the Seattle Style exhibit that is MOHI owned, not the loans, unfortunately. And then other things that we've been putting up recently of trying to have more and more of our collection available online. As far as new exhibits, I don't have anything that I can announce yet. I mean, I'm always trying to get stuff out. I mentioned that we have some World's Fair things on display. So there's a couple cases throughout the museum that I rotate every 6 months. And then there's a big case that if you've been in the museum, you stand in the grand atrium, you can look at sort of back at where the front desk is, and then above it, there's this big case that fits about 5 mannequins or one really grand thing sometimes. And so I try to do different topics there so that we have 5 garments from the World's Fair. And then I try to do programs at the museum. So I have a program called Behind the Seams. Got one coming up in May of getting stuff out from the collection and showing it in person and talking about some things that we have and trying to get them out. So I don't have a fashion exhibit to announce at this point, but I'm always trying to find opportunities to get stuff from our collection out in front of people.
That's awesome. Thank you. And for anyone in the audience that is interested in learning more about MOHI or any upcoming exhibits that may come along in the future, the website is mohi.org. And I believe we dropped a link to that in our chat. So you can, oh, there it is again. So you can access that website whenever you'd like to learn more or see their picture collections. There's a really interesting question. Do you have kind of a broad definition of fashion and how that definition may have changed over time?
Ooh, that's a really good question. So I'll give you sort of an official or a definition that I was given in grad school that you can decide if this is correct or not. That fashion, one of the key elements of fashion is change for the sake of change. So there's a lot of, there's things that are really beautiful and are made with a lot of, so I was taught that sort of fashion officially by our Western definition started in the Renaissance, that prior to that, people had elaborate clothing, but there wasn't a culture of having the latest thing. It was always about the most opulent thing. And that there was, places around the world that were making incredible garments, but they weren't changing just for the sake of having the newest, latest thing. And that there was this kind of change in the Renaissance, partially with merchants coming up of that being in and having the latest thing. So you can kind of debate that as it's a very Western centered idea. And so that definition is that fashion is something that is kind of ephemeral by definition, and that we know that what we're wearing today is going to be outdated in a few months or years or whatever, and that we'll look back and things will look dated. So that kind of change for the sake of change in our clothing, versus something like outdoor gear that is changing because the technology is changing, or it's changing because if it's working, we're not changing it. If it's not working, we're trying to improve it. So that's a definition I have heard that does kind of prioritize the sort of fashion industry and change and sort of the ephemeral nature of it. I'm also okay using fashion to just refer to what people wear, and being okay with using that word to refer to everyday clothing, to things that people don't think of as fashion, because I hate seeing people sort of being deprecating about what they're wearing. If it's something that they enjoy wearing, it would never make the pages of Vogue, but it's something that makes them feel like themselves and it makes them feel empowered. So I am a little slippery with my definition of using that term fashion, because there are some sort of fashion people who have a very kind of narrower definition. And I think that works for some things, but I like being democratic about it. And if you want to call what you're wearing fashion, go right ahead.
I like that. The definition of fashion is like Seattle's fashion. We like to have a little flexibility and do what we want.
Yeah. We don't want to be pinned down.
Yes.
We don't like labels.
I love it. Another question that we've got is, I know you talked about grunge as kind of a really fundamental, influential era of fashion in Seattle. Is there any other particular era or period of time that you would say is really impactful in terms of fashion in the Northwest, or in terms of the Northwest's impact on fashion?
Yeah, I think grunge is its kind of own thing because it was a time when people outside of Seattle recognized Seattle as the center of something
Mhm.
on a really big scale. Although I will say, going back to the era, this era of the casual wear, in the 80s and 90s, there was something called the Seattle Pre-Line, which was, I think, 3 or 4 times a year. It was kind of like a fashion week in Seattle,
Mhm.
where it was sort of like buyers from around the country, from Macy's and all kinds of department stores. There was like a fashion week time when they would come to Seattle and see the latest looks from Union Bay, from Genera, from International News. And it's funny, the articles you read about it. I think the other thing about grunge is that Seattle knew it was big and the world knew it was big. And there's all these articles in the 80s about the Seattle Pre-Line and how Seattleites are like totally unaware that this is going on. Like the city's like filling up with these fashion execs who are coming to see the latest stuff in, casual teen wear, boys wear, jeans. And their Pre-Line's a huge deal. But Seattle, and like the taxi drivers know, but the average Seattleite has like not even heard of this.
Mhm.
So there's kind of eras like that are influential and are that the fashion world kind of knows about, but it's not the high fashion world. It's the like kind of the mall department stores that like, because like I said, Union Bay was a brand that I wore like in high school, that it was at JCPenney, it was at Macy's, it was at the Bon. So that's not, like pages of Vogue, but that is a huge piece of the industry of what teens are wearing.
Mhm.
So that's probably the biggest. I'm sure after this, I'm going to think of another time. The outdoor gear, the Klondike Gold Rush, that was creating a whole gear industry that turned into something. But, we also, San Francisco, it wasn't like the only place where that was happening.
Mhm.
We keep about that.
Yeah. And it's hard because, there's probably something in every era that's really influential, but maybe doesn't rise to a certain level.
Yeah, grunge was kind of this perfect storm of, it just was recognition within the city and by everyone. And it kind of,
Mhm.
everyone could see at the same time that this was important, whether they were dismissing it or not, but they could tell that it was a moment.
Yeah. Yeah. Awesome. Thank you. So let's see. Do you have any good resources for things like lists of current designers in the area now, or current shops that are of note?
That is a really good question. I feel like I have made lists and then they shift and change really quickly. One of the most, I feel like someone to follow, either her website or she's on social media, is there's a woman named Sydney Mintle who runs a fashion PR business called Gossip and Glamour. And I feel like she is on top of what's going on today more than anybody I know. So she has a newsletter and she posts on social media and stuff. And she has a business too. So I'm not, like not plugging. I don't know. This isn't a paid promotion for Gossip and Glamour, but she's someone that I feel like seems to know the most about what's current so I don't know that sometimes she'll have lists of things, or sort of end of year, like gift buying, where she'll list, companies that you can buy stuff from locally. It's never totally comprehensive, but it's a great place to start.
Thank you. Awesome. We've got a question here about kind of brick and mortar retailers versus online. So the person asking this question has noticed that a lot of things like lower price shops or consignment shops and thrift shops have been closing up, but there are more maybe higher price brick and mortar shops available. Do you think that that has made a shift in the way that people shop based on their income level or their, clothing budget?
Yeah, that's a good question, and part of a much bigger question, especially with the pandemic.
Yeah.
I didn't even mention, Amazon is a local company. It's a global company, but it is obviously based locally and is, if it has not already, is close to being one of the biggest clothing retailers in the world, or at least in the US. And so online shopping, and that's huge. That's another thing that's coming out of Seattle. I guess I haven't noticed particularly that sort of lower end versus higher end split. I mean, there were some long-term high end stores in Seattle that did close during the pandemic, or before actually. Butch Blum was started as a menswear store, but was men's and women's, and they closed in I think late 2019 or early 2020. And then Baby and Company was a really beloved boutique that was down on First Avenue that they're still around, but they're not in Seattle. They're like in Sun Valley, Idaho, I think, and then might have pop-ups in Seattle. So I feel like there are some pretty high-end places that have been hit hard as well. I think, yeah, I remember that I think it was Bruce Nordstrom who went to a talk once, and he talked about when Nordstrom purchased Best Apparel and how he and his brothers went to go check out this women's store, and they were so appalled that they went up and there was just this woman sitting at a desk asking if they had an appointment, and that it was like there was no merchandise out, there was no, you had to make an appointment and see an attendant to try on this stuff.
Right.
At the time, that was customer service. That was like the best level. That was what that clientele wanted. But they kind of realized that the next clientele wanted to be able to look through the stuff. They wanted to be able to browse. They didn't have to make an appointment to come to this clothing store. And he made this comment that people always want customer service, but what customer service looks like changes. And so I think those demographics of who wants to go shopping in person and who wants to shop online. And our stores, if you're a brick and mortar store catering to a clientele that wants to shop online, it's not going to work. But if you're a brick and mortar store that has a clientele that wants to be in person to buy stuff, then you're on target. So it's hard to pin down who it is, but it's like, what is the demographic? What's the client? And people have different needs for customer service.
That's a really good explanation. Thank you. We're getting to the last few minutes, and we're going to try and get to as many questions as possible, but we might have to wrap up shortly. So one of our last questions is, how do you think Filson's was or was not an influence?
Yeah, Filson, I mean, it's interesting because Filson, especially now, I mean, they really are kind of what we think of as a heritage company, that they have really stuck with their aesthetic a long time. So what their sort of iconic pieces, like the Mackinac Cruiser, some of their bags, that they're not like Eddie Bauer. They've never kind of moved into Gore-Tex. They're not outfitting like mountaineers. So they're kind of sticking with a sort of early 20th century aesthetic of what outdoor gear is, but also that kind of still works for certain kinds of activities. This still the best stuff. I mean, there's forestry people, there's like fishing that I was just there. They have a archive. There's a place called Barn Owl Vintage that had this pop-up shop in Filson of some vintage Filson pieces. And he also has this Filson slicker that his friend wore for 2 seasons going fish as working on like an Alaska fishing boat that is hardy, and it's got all this sort of internal wear, but you can tell that it was really worked for him. And so that still works for certain, like the stuff it was made for, people who still have those jobs, it's still like the best stuff. So I think Filson, I mean, they're innovative in the gear they were making, that they're still making it today. It's still working. And then also they've stuck with their aesthetic, that they have this influence now is like, people love that heritage brand element of it, of this like kind of classic Seattle company, this classic, that's sort of made the same way, that's got this classic look to it. So that's now kind of cutting edge again of really that sort of Americana, stuff that has been around for a long time because it has worked for a long time.
Thank you. We have another question about a company. Do you know anything about White Stag, and was that a Seattle-based company?
Oh my gosh, I don't remember. I feel like I have researched that before and I forget the answer to that question. I think it is a Seattle company, but I think it's sort of hard to pin down because a lot of these companies then have been like purchased by another company. And so they're a subsidiary. So it's like they still have a Seattle office, but they're part of a bigger thing. So I have to admit that I do not have a good answer for that. I wish I did, but I think you might be right that it is a Seattle company.
Thank you. And then one last one. Do you have any ideas on what any coming trends or developments might be in local fashion and style?
I wish, so it's harder for historians to kind of look into the future. We're really
Yeah.
looking at the past, but I guess I can make two. Well, one guess I would hope for. So one, of course, I mentioned the definition of fashion, and one challenge with the fashion industry is that change for the sake of change is terrible for the environment. That the way the fashion industry works now, and I did reference with Britannia and these jeans companies that they were making stuff overseas. It's a pretty wasteful way to make clothing. And if I have a hope for the future, both for Seattle and for sort of fashion more generally, is to take a much harder look at that sustainability piece and figuring out how we can make clothes that we love to wear, that we're excited to wear, that don't have this horrible impact on the environment and don't have these horrible implications of who's making them and how those people are being treated and how those people are being paid. How can we make fashion better for the earth, better for the people that are making it? So that is my hope for what's next, is that we have much more sustainable clothing.
Thank you. That's a great answer. And I'm afraid that we have run out of time. I know we wish we could ask a lot more questions and learn a lot more, but Clara, thank you so much for being here today. We are so happy to have you. For anyone in the audience who would like to learn more again about MOHI, their website is mohi.org. If you'd like to learn more about library programs, please visit snow-isle.org. And thank you all so much for being here and for enjoying this program with us.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
It's been a pleasure.